So we're going to be starting now. I would like to introduce you first to Connor Daly, a teaching fellow here at Trinity, who will introduce the series of lectures we're having today. So please welcome Connor Daly.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Good evening, dobry wieczór. Дякуємо, що ви тут з нами. My name is Connor Daly, so I'm welcoming you here to the second lecture in our series, Understanding Resistance in Europe's East. Andrei Bykovchenko of TCD's brand new Ukrainian Society, who you've just heard, will be introducing our speaker, Tanya Lokot. But first, I'd like to give you a little bit of brief background on our series so far. The series is inspired by the ongoing multidisciplinary research of the Trinity Center for Resistance Studies, established nearly 4 years ago by my colleague Balázs Opor. It was set up to provide an intellectual response to the growth of populism, to the growth of authoritarianism around the globe. And by resistance, in the terms of this series, we're talking about a phenomenon global in its geographical scope, but which has a variety of forms: political opposition, cultural opposition, resilience, protest, nonconformism, and finally dissent. And resistance is a concept that can relate to the individual as well as to the society or the community as a whole. Krzysztof Rowiński of Polish Studies and myself, who I specialize, I guess, in Central and East European area studies. We're both from the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies. We also have a hand in putting this series together. So I'm speaking here tonight on behalf of all three of us. In last week's lecture, Graham Murdoch of the Department of History used his personal experiences of life as a young research scholar in Timișoara in 1990, only a few months after the Romanian Revolution of 1989, the overthrow of Ceausescu, where he found himself, as he told us, perplexed by the silence of his peer group around what had happened. And Graham defined for us this part of the east of Europe as a veritable laboratory for the study of resistance in the modern period. So deeply, he said, did it experience the twin totalitarian terrors of fascism and communism. So a place as well where the new nation states that emerged after World War I grappled with the demands of what had been latent in the old empires, latent minorities, new interest groups within those new state boundaries, and groups that challenged the imposition of these new controls. And so tonight we're looking forward to hearing about the role of the citizen in today's Ukraine, where a whole people is engaged in what's effectively an existential fight for cultural and political survival as a sovereign people, against what many commentators are calling a revisionist Russia, exploiting a narrative of NATO expansion to end that autonomy and to extinguish independent Ukrainian identity and recast Ukraine as a puppet state. And in future lectures, we're going to be hearing about the phenomenon of the Soviet dissident. We'll hear about resistance movements in Poland. We're going to be hearing about, and that's from Solidarity to the present day, dedicated sessions on Czechoslovakia, on Hungary and Bulgaria, and finally a roundtable discussion on the 10th of April, which some of the people here will be participating in. So you're all very welcome. You're going to be welcome to every lecture in the series. To say as well that the series is part funded by the TCD Faculty Events Fund. And I need, before I pass the baton back to Andrei, to acknowledge the excellent support of 3 of the college's student societies in promoting our series, in chairing our lectures: the History Society, the East European Society, and tonight's host, the Ukrainian Society. So I'd like to hand back the microphone to tonight's Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Andrei Bykovchenko, to introduce our speaker. Andrei, over to you.
Hello, my name is Andrei, as you heard just now. I'm an OCM in the Ukrainian Society here in Trinity. So if it's not only Eastern Europe that you're interested in, but Ukraine more specifically as well, then I would like to invite you to come to our events too. It is truly wonderful to see the interest in this event, a discussion that brings Eastern European resistance into academic circles where it rightfully belongs. I would like to thank the Eastern European Society for organizing this series of lectures. Today's lecture will last for 40 to 45 minutes, and you'll be able to ask any questions that arise right after. Emergency exits are located at the top of the stairs on both sides of the auditorium, and unfortunately, the use of phones is not permitted during the lecture. I was asked to write a short foreword for today's discussion, and when one thinks of how to introduce Eastern European resistance, one, of course, thinks of its history. And the history of Eastern European resistance, it reaches medieval times. Resistance to foreign invaders and oppressors continuously evolves to meet new challenges. It has never been static, always adapting, always harnessing the most advanced ideas and cutting-edge technology. Oppression, as history teaches us, is rarely about moral or intellectual superiority. More often, it stems from an intoxicating hunger for domination, wielded through brute, mindless force and suppression. Yet against this force, Eastern European has cultivated a tradition of all-encompassing enlightened resistance that constantly finds new ways to push back. It is not possible to have a talk on resistance in Eastern Europe while omitting Ukraine. There are very few countries that needed to resist such a big force in the modern-day world. Ukrainian society is facing means of oppression and abuse never seen before. That is why it is particularly encouraging to see students interested in today's discussion, because today's resistance is deeply embedded in the digital world, the world of people like you and me, navigating our daily lives through phones, social media, and online networks. What may seem like ordinary, mundane actions can in fact become powerful forms of resistance, weapons, both defensive and offensive. And I think that there is no better person to guide us through this topic than our distinguished guest today. Dr. Tanya Lokot is an assistant professor in digital media and society and the program chair of the MA in social media communications at the School of Communications. She specializes in digital rights, network authoritarianism, digital resistance, and the internet freedom in Eastern Europe. She's also the author of Beyond the Protest Square, Digital Media and Augmented Dissent, an in-depth study of the role of digital media in Ukraine's revolution of dignity. A native of Ukraine, a professor, an author, a thought leader. Please welcome Dr. Tanya Lokot.
Do that. This, I break things. Aha. The projector is no longer blank. This is excellent. Thank you very much to Connor and Andriy for this excellent introduction, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of the lecture series. I really look forward to also attending some of the forthcoming events, which Connor has given us a whirlwind tour of. And I think Andriy really gave a really apt introduction leading up to my talk today, because he talked about the history of resistance in Eastern Europe and Ukraine as one of the countries in the region, as going back centuries, decades, years, but also being something that evolves and keeps adapting. And this is very much going to be the focus of what I'm going to be talking about, because I think it's fair to say that, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, and in particular, the full-scale invasion that started in February 2022 by Russia, has been called one of the most online wars, one of the most socially mediated wars. And, it's not a competition as much as it's nice to have that title. But it's true that the war and the way that citizens have participated in this war takes a very different turn when everybody has a smartphone in their hand and when the things you do online on social media basically take the shape of, the war becomes part of your daily life, but it also becomes part of your daily existence that you lead in the social media and in the digital spaces. So I would really like to focus on this aspect and also focus specifically on what the citizens do when they face this existential threat that Andriy so aptly described. So in my talk, I'm going to try and focus on digital resistance practices of Ukrainian citizens and how they use social media platforms during the ongoing war. And I want to reflect on how Ukrainian citizens incorporate the daily reality of war into their digital media routines, but also how these mundane activities of documenting, expressing their emotions, witnessing, are actually shaped into practices of resistance. And in particular, I want to talk about resistance because I know Connor described, resistance as we can talk about it in many ways. We can talk about it as political, cultural actions. We can talk about it as occupying space. I want to talk about resistance as producing knowledge. And that's going to be kind of the conceptual focus on my talk. And I'm going to focus on all of the different ways that citizens find of producing and sharing knowledge about the war, about their experiences, and about the broader context of what's going on. So I'm going to introduce a few concepts. As you know, I am an academic, so I'm going to try and provide some operational vocabulary for us. So obviously, when we talk about Ukraine and resistance by citizens in the context of Russian aggression, we acknowledge first and foremost that this aggression and this resistance did not start in February 2022, and in fact didn't even start in 2014 when Russia first illegally occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. The aggression in its various forms and in its various guises was there. It was also, we could classify it as oppression, cultural, political, economic, but also resistance has been there for throughout all this time. At the same time, I think it's really interesting to talk about citizen resistance now when all the socio-political processes in most of the world are now, in particular in Ukraine, are seeing high levels of digital and social media use. And we're not just talking about citizens, we're also talking about governments, officials, military actors, media outlets, and ordinary citizens. Everybody is using digital media for a variety of different purposes, right? At the same time, there's also very clear understanding that in both the national and international context, we're also seeing ongoing, very organized network disinformation operations on the part of Russia, targeting Ukrainian, Russian, and global audiences, trying to present the events that are unfolding in a very particular light, either justifying what Russia is doing in Ukraine through the threat of NATO, or through saying, oh, Ukraine is not a real country and it never was anyway, so we're not actually invading anybody, we're just taking what's rightfully ours. But those disinformation operations have also been going on for quite a long time. And at the same time, what Ukraine and Ukrainians are doing is trying to resist these narratives and trying to create different kinds and promote different kinds of knowledge to resist this prevailing view of Ukraine that most of the world has had, which either views it in the context of dominant Western colonial understandings, which have shaped how much of the Western citizens view the rest of the world, if they know anything about it, but also in the context of pervasive Russian imperialist narratives, which I've just mentioned, right? So it is very much trying to change the perception of the country as a whole and also of its citizens, of its right to existence, its culture, its politics, its art. So it's a much bigger project. And in more practical terms, in the territories that Russia has been occupying, some since 2014 and some since 2022, we also see the rise of networked authoritarianism, where essentially Russia is not just co-opting the political establishment and the resources, land, governance, but they're also co-opting digital spaces, right? By literally reconnecting parts of Ukraine that are under occupation to the Russian internet with all of the filtering, blocking, and censorship that we know already is happening inside Russia. So we can also think about the importance of resistance also in digital spaces, also in that sense, right? Because the occupied parts are not just occupied materially or territorially, they're also occupied in digital space. And so in a way, what citizens are facing today is what William Marin, Matt Ford, and Andrew Hoskins called participative or participatory warfare, where everybody has more opportunities to participate in the war, partly because everything is so intensely digitally mediated. And so what I'm interested in exploring is what are the affordances and limitations of this digital ecosystem that everybody is involved in anyway for participating in war, and how they shape and are shaped by citizen online media practices, and specifically in the area of participatory knowledge production. So in terms of Ukraine's histories of resistance, scholarship on civic participation, resistance, and citizen representation in Ukraine has, of course, focused on the more visible and material forms of political and civic engagement and protests, such as elections and how Ukrainians participate or don't participate in them, but also things like large-scale protest events, right? And there's lots of research and scholarship on that. So we know that Ukraine has a tradition of protest, that Ukrainians are used to protesting. And in particular, of course, to those who are not really long-standing scholars of Ukraine, when you ask them what they know about Ukrainian protests, they will always think about the Euromaidan protests of 2013-2014, which is also known as the Revolution of Dignity, which was transformative for Ukrainian civil society and spurred a new civic ethos of activism and participation based on the values of individual freedom, responsibility, and dignity. At the same time, when we talk about things like Euromaidan, we always talk about how unique it was in the sense that it wasn't led by any particular political force or any particular political party or a charismatic leader. It was very much a horizontal protest, and it exemplifies how Ukrainian citizens have relied on the openness and power of horizontal networks to mobilize for collective action and make claims away from or alongside centralized authority. So to put it more plainly, Ukrainians are used to getting things done and resisting without relying on government, opposition parties, right? And that is very important because it's a tradition that has grown and has become quite stable at this point. We also see in more recent scholarship the shift after 2014 to more fluid, more informal, more horizontal, and more diverse forms of activism and resistance, and the power of personalized everyday acts of citizenship, these micro-level network practices, which especially started to be visible during the growing Russian aggression since 2014 and came to the forefront since February 2022. And what I'm interested in is understanding how using tools that are provided by digital media platforms, citizens can engage in resistance and see it as a path to epistemic agency. And by epistemic agency, I mean the power and authority to generate knowledge that changes people's perceptions of how they view your country, your fellow countrymen, and everything they know about what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Because of digital media being ubiquitous. War is globally visible. Everybody knows that something is going on in Ukraine, but it's legible in different ways, depending on which channels you consume, which media you read, which languages you speak, which Reddit, subreddits you follow. You will see different things and you will understand what is happening in very different ways. Ukrainians, of course, use digital spaces to perform their being Ukrainian, with the goal of making their participation in war and their resistance to aggression more visible, but also more legible and more knowable. And it's important because this is actually a direct expression of being citizens, right? Because we know from literature on digital citizenship that these acts in networked spaces bring citizens into being as subjects to power, but also subjects of power. And so seemingly mundane and very small speech acts, things that people say, deeds that words perform, become important because they make discourse, performance, representation, explanation central to doing citizenship. So in part, we are citizens because we are able to claim that we are citizens, and we are able to generate knowledge that other people might use to learn about what it's like to be a citizen of Ukraine at this particular time. So there's a growing body of work on citizen digital media use in Ukraine, and in particular in situations of occupation, displacement, being part of the diaspora, and even on the front line. So we know that different Ukrainian citizens, no matter where they are and how close or far away from the battlefield they are, that they are using digital media, and in part using it to produce knowledge about their experiences and about the war as a transformative event. So the questions that I'm asking are, how do citizens practice network resistance, and how do they navigate the challenges and constraints of this huge hybrid communication ecosystem during the war? And how does citizen knowledge production in networked spaces in the context of this participatory warfare address the challenges of achieving epistemic agency? How can people gain agency through producing knowledge about their experiences of the war? And I posit that we should see citizens operating in network spaces as epistemic agents, because they're not just individuals that interact with the media because they're audiences of media messages. They're not just sitting there as passive recipients watching their feeds, but because they also produce media messages, sometimes on a systematic and continuous basis, as if they're media professionals working on a voluntary basis. So more and more, we're seeing citizens perceiving themselves as agents of knowledge production, and they see that as an integral part of their resistance and war participation efforts. So I'm going to show you examples and show you quotes that come from my ongoing research project, where I'm looking at what people are doing on social media, but I'm also talking to people directly about their choices, about their experiences, about their feelings. And I think those two things together really bring to the fore some specific dynamics that we're seeing in how people are producing knowledge about the war and how it may or may not empower them as citizens. So there are three core categories of wartime epistemic resistance repertoires. I'm going to talk about all three of them and give you some examples. So first is narrative resistance, and this is specifically how we communicate and what communicative devices and tools we use in order to change the knowledge that people have about the war, or to correct knowledge about the war. And some of these things might be familiar to you, especially if you're a student of journalism or media or communication studies. Framing and agenda setting, right? That's what the media usually do. But in this case, it's not just the media, it's also the citizens who are intervening in the conversations in digital spaces and trying to explain to people or correct their perceptions of what the war is about, why it's happening, who is involved. To some extent, they're also trying to articulate, right, how we should talk about the war. And in some cases, literally also doing the work of translating information and knowledge about the war into other languages. Which is really important because they're not just reaching a Ukrainian audience or even a Russian-speaking audience, they're trying to reach a global audience. They're also doing the work of curating and reframing the knowledge that already exists, providing historical and political context for the conflict, for the war, but also for the things that preceded, for the legacies of colonialism, imperial conquest, and resistance, histories that Ukraine has a very intimate knowledge of and that have shaped Ukraine as a country, as a nation, and that also have shaped Ukrainian sense of national and civic identity. And of course, because we already mentioned disinformation, part of the work of corrective communication or narrative resistance is also directly debunking some of those false and misleading narratives that circulate in digital spaces. So this is an example of a little infographic that was created and then was spread in many different variants. So this is just one variant of many. It's an example of framing. How do we talk about the war in Ukraine without being ignorant? But also it's an example of corrective work, right? Where we're actually saying, don't say events in Ukraine, crisis in Ukraine, conflict in Ukraine, say the Russia-Ukraine war, because there are two participants in the war, right? They're also saying you should avoid words that imply shared responsibility. You should say who started the war or who invaded whom, right? So this is a good example of this narrative resistance work. Another example is trying to create content and communication tools that work globally, right? Using content that is understandable in multiple languages with minimal amount of words, but also intentionally switching your communication online to other languages, creating these long explainer threads that are very useful to people who have very little knowledge, but also using punchy images, videos, and graphics. This is a good example. This is Ukraine following today's official annexation in Moscow, which was published when Moscow announced that it has officially annexed those eastern regions. And Ukraine was like, it's the same map, so nothing has really changed. Right, so again, very impactful, but also clearly trying to articulate that sometimes when the aggressor says things, it doesn't mean that the reality on the ground has changed. The border remains where it was. Curating and reframing knowledge, right? So many wonderful projects that were started by some by journalists, but some by ordinary citizens, right? Who started podcast series, again, wrote long explainer posts, sometimes correcting viral posts by other people who we shall not name in this room. But literally, right? Like creating history lessons for people and saying, look, even in the Harvard Library, we have historical maps and we can see that Crimea has always been part of Ukraine, and not only Crimea, but also Kuban, which is a region in Russia. But, we won't go there. So alongside narrative resistance, which is obviously very important because, it provides facts and it provides archival data and it appeals to the rational part of people's brains, we also have effective resistance, and that is when people share their embodied knowledge. And now this type of knowledge is always viewed with suspicion because, and whenever people talk about their own experiences, very often the reaction they get is, oh, but you're biased because you're Ukrainian. But I think this type of knowledge sharing is very important because it actually allows people to share literally what they're going through, which is what kind of is the point of social media as they were designed, is to let people share slices of their lives, but also providing opportunities for personal storytelling and testimonies of real people who are experiencing battlefields, displacement, occupation, trauma, and grief, and sometimes living through these things and trying to figure out how they feel, right, in those same spaces where they're also sharing facts. In the same way, the important use of social media for documenting evidence and sharing records of war crimes, losses, both material and personal, talking about the importance of foregrounding human rights and seeking justice, right? All of this is also part of sharing embodied knowledge. And of course, one important use of social media channels by Ukrainians is also to use them to assign blame and responsibility, holding particular individuals, countries, institutions to account, right? And we're primarily, of course, talking about Russia and the Russian government, but we're also talking about other people inside Russia and also other individuals who are not Russian or not affiliated with the Russian state, but who maybe share part of the blame for what is happening. So here, I think really using personal stories and framing what it feels like to experience this war is particularly impactful because it creates a kind of knowledge that you can't get from just reading media reports or just, you know, looking at photos. This is people actually saying, this is what it feels like every day, right? This is what we're dealing with. All these things can happen in the span of a day, right? You have some drones and some shelling in the morning, some people die, then you have to go to work, then you read some news, then you listen to Taylor Swift, then you have a planned power outage, which you have prepared for, maybe or maybe not, and that's just the ordinary day. And I think even though it might seem like this is kind of making things more mundane and it's not as impactful, to me and to some of my interviewees, it actually seems like this is in fact more impactful. But it also feels like it's a job that people have to do. And that idea of saying, well, of course we're emotional because that's what happens when war comes to your country. It makes you emotional, right? So you get these very, very pivotal responses where, you know, some normal social media engagement is happening on some of these corporate accounts. And then the Ukrainian killjoys come into the room and they're like, what are you reading? Like, I live in Ukraine, so I'm reading obituaries of people killed by Russia. People who spend a lot of their time volunteering and raising money for, you know, either the military or military medics or pets in occupied territories, right? They're basically saying, this is how I feel inside and this is what I post on social media, right? It's all really bad, but also we need you to donate, you know, or if you can't donate, at least retweet this post, right? So this is actually a really, I think, impactful way of bringing a normalized context of the war to other people and kind of showing them that this is not normal. Like, in no world is doing this part of anybody's normal routine, and yet here we are. And this is a quote from one of my interviewees who actually felt very keenly that it was necessary to do this kind of work, to share that very impactful, emotional, effective content. But she said, I'm simply torn apart at times from realizing that we must turn our grief into content so that we can be given the damn assistance in order to survive, right? So this is anger, but it's also kind of inevitability. Like, this is part of our daily work as citizens. And of course, and apologies for the sensitive images, part of the work of documentation of these embodied experiences is also again showing that in no world is this normal, but it is also very likely that what happened in places like Bucha or Irpin or elsewhere can happen to anybody, anywhere inside Ukraine on any given day. But it's also potentially likely that this might also happen to other social media users elsewhere in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and maybe elsewhere around the world, right? So really jarring images juxtaposed with photos of ordinary users do this work of bringing visibility, but also showing the sharp contrast between the lives people led previously and the fact that because they are holders of a certain passport or speakers of a certain language or residents of a certain part of the earth, they can face extermination, death, torture, etc., just because of what is happening inside their country. And again, this is a quote from another person I interviewed, who again was expressing anger, again, at having to do this work of taking these really painful news stories and images and having to make them visible in order to get attention and in order to get support from the rest of the world. He said, I think about this all the time. It's as if we don't get to honor our dead without lifting them up and showing them off to others, as if even our dead must put in the work. And obviously the really important work of debunking false claims. This is a good example. You might remember the story of a Russian film documentary maker, Anastasia Trofimova, whose film Russians at War was shown at some of the festivals, including TIFF, and claimed to show the real and normal Russians, and they have families and they have sympathy for Ukrainians. So Ukrainian users would very quickly bring stories like this, right, which again are part of the everyday existence of Ukrainians, and say, yes, obviously, very normal, lots of sympathy for Ukrainians. And then literally fact-checking news stories about this particular person and how she was presenting the film that she was promoting, and actual stories of her filming footage, and collaborating with Russian state media, and how what she's showing in the film is actually misrepresenting what is actually happening on the front line. Finally, the third, and I think maybe less visible type of resistance and the kind of work that citizens do on digital media is this idea of algorithmic resistance. And this is very much about not just resisting the aggressor or resisting colonial or imperialist narratives that exist about Ukraine, but having to also resist the platforms that enable all of this stuff. And yet we also have to resist, the news recommendation systems, the algorithms, the way our feeds are built on X or on Facebook or on Instagram, because those feeds have a certain logic and they have a certain profit model, and that model doesn't necessarily work always in favor of Ukrainians trying to promote their stories and talk about their lives. So in a way, obviously, Ukrainians aren't the only ones who are trying to strategically use algorithms and complaint tools, but they're using them on more publicly facing platforms, especially where they interface with other global audiences. Well, first of all, to debunk disinformation, but also to fact check, what other ordinary users are saying who maybe just don't know any better. And also they get very creative when they try to subvert those adversarial algorithmic and platform logics. And this work is not as visible because it doesn't entail necessarily posting impactful images or sharing your life story, but it does entail being, forgive me, very anal and using all of the available mechanisms to take down posts that contain misinformation, reporting people who are posting hateful stuff, and literally asking everybody to go like certain posts because that will make them more visible. So one of the examples from X is, X, formerly Twitter, has this thing called community notes, which Facebook is now also going to adopt, where instead of being very good at moderating content that violates the platform's terms of service. They're saying, if you think this post is misrepresenting something, or if it's misinformation or it's misleading, you can just write a community note. And then if enough people find your community note helpful, we will show it under the post, which will be like a kind of community fact check. And so we have Ukrainian social media users who basically spend several hours every day going around writing these community notes and then asking other people to vote for them so that they get more visibility, right? So anytime somebody posts something silly, they're like, no, that's a lie. Here's a fact check. Here's a source. Can you please like this for more visibility, right? Again, if there are any fakes, even video fakes, they're asking people to, to actually make the community note more visible that says, this is fake. This is a AI doctored video. This is not real, right? And again, work is invisible and yet is very important because it actually impacts, if enough people do it, what other people see in their feeds. Other things where literally what Ukrainians are doing is doing kind of on the spot media literacy training, right? Where suddenly you start to see posts in Ukrainian that all look exactly the same, that are telling heart-rending stories about Ukrainians being mobilized against their will. And to be fair, right, maybe some of those stories are true, but once you start seeing dozens of posts that have exactly the same wording, that's a bit unlikely that it's just coming from real users, right? Especially if the people posting or the accounts posting these identical pieces of text are, have these like numbers in their account handles and all of that stuff. So you start to see people who are literally training other users who are maybe less experienced in how to spot botnets and in how to spot these engineered campaigns which are trying to push particular narratives, and explaining to them that, like, hello, this isn't real. If you see this, and if you look for a particular phrase and you see 20 posts that all look exactly the same, it's probably a fake, right? Or if you see an account called Megatron Run saying, breaking news, Ukraine bans Christianity. They're like, what? Breaking, trust me. What's your source? Trust me. Megatron Run says Ukraine banned Christianity, so it must be true. But then also capitalizing on and subverting algorithmic logics. And here I am introducing you to one of my favorite viral phenomena to come out of Ukrainian Twitter, now known as X, where people are trying to game visibility algorithms and metrics by basically engaging in kind of mass commenting or mass canceling or mass reporting. And the term that somebody came up with for this is, that is now part of Urban Dictionary and Wikipedia, is the Jackal Express, which is essentially, I think the best translation is the cancel train, where people say, this account is telling lies. Can we call the Jackal Express? And then everybody starts to come in and basically say, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying, this isn't true, here's a fact check. So in a way, it's kind of like a community note, but also it's basically like a mass shaming session where everybody gets on the bandwagon and tries to make sure that everybody sees that not only is this disinformation, we all know that it's not true. And so, or like this is a distorting the picture of what's actually happening. So in terms of what kinds of challenges people engaging in all of these different types of work on social media, and it is work, even though it's mostly and primarily unpaid, people's ways of how they try to generate knowledge about the war adjust to these logics that already exist, right? They know that emotion might not make their stories or posts immediately trustworthy, but it does make them more impactful. And they know that networked expertise has its own logic, where achieving visibility in the process of knowledge sharing tends to stress both emotionality and individual experience. So it's not always about, are you an expert in this? It's like, have you actually lived through this experience? Can you share your lived embodied knowledge about living through a siege or trying to get out of a burning building once it's been hit by a drone? And again, there is obviously in journalism and media studies this dilemma about effective proximity, where the locals who are very close to events on the ground are often seen as kind of prejudiced, and they're also seen as lacking credibility, which Johanna Kotisova calls epistemic injustice, where you are actually the one most impacted and affected by the crisis or the war, and yet you are also seen as the least credible because you're too close to the action, right? And people tend to mistrust you just because you're so close geographically, ethnically, or nationally to the thing that is happening. And of course, the other issue is that the platforms that I mostly talked about, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, X, are public, right? But propaganda and misinformation and misleading narratives also spread on less visible platforms and also in offline spaces where they're much harder to track, identify, and resist. We also know that organized disinformation operations are often supported by financial power, right? There is literal money that people receive for writing these fake posts or posting as impersonating dozens of different accounts, where citizen resistance tends to be grassroots and often depends on how quickly influencers or popular users can mobilize others to respond to some kind of crisis or injustice. And of course, we also know that existing dominant media narratives, geopolitical narratives, cultural narratives can have improbably high durability, and they're very hard to displace, right? And that it's almost automatic. As soon as you start to say it's not Putin's war, it's Russians' war, somebody will come and say, not all Russians, right? So that readiness of saying, well, not everybody is guilty, but everybody is responsible, right? And displacing those narratives that prioritize and trust certain actors and certain parts of the world more and other parts of the world less because of historic conditions, because of imperial or colonial developments, those things are really hard to shake, right? And then on top of that, we also have algorithmic injustice, where platforms also have power, and very often, no matter how hard citizens try to resist the logics of the platform, which wants to make shocking content more visible, which wants to make content that is paid for more visible, that's also really hard to push against. And of course, because Ukrainians have been resisting oppression, aggression, erasure for so long, and because there's been so much misinformation already, that pre-existing trauma is also an obstacle to building trust and authority between themselves and between Ukrainians and other people around the world. But I think it's worth pointing out that knowledge production practices are central to how people participate in war and also how they resist oppression and aggression. And such practices are, of course, political, even though they might seem like just a bunch of people writing silly comments or posting fun memes on social media. And they are a necessary part of the overall repertoire of how we resist and how Ukrainians resist. So pushing against those logics, platform logics, mainstream media logics, but also finding clever ways of co-opting or subverting them, or building alternative mechanisms, finding creative ways of inserting yourself into the conversation and creating and sharing knowledge through humor, for instance, right? Or through building on something that people find that is already very familiar. Those are all really important ways of achieving epistemic agency. So that personalized and reflexive knowledge production through narrative, effective, and algorithmic resistance practices is very important, right? Because it helps people to feel like the knowledge they're creating actually makes a difference. And even though a lot of the examples I've shared are quite effective and emotional in nature because they deal with people's lived experiences, they do have that power that, again, Johanna Kotisova calls the strategic rationality of emotional expression, that just because somebody is emotional doesn't mean they're not making a good point. And just because somebody is telling an emotional story doesn't mean that story isn't valid. So contextualizing the Russian invasion and its brutality as part of Ukraine's continuous history of resisting oppression and enduring Russia's attempts to erase its identity, sovereignty, independence, really wins and becomes more powerful when it's supported by all of these participatory practices and people producing knowledge in all of these various ways. I think it's also important as researchers to look at these micro practices and to look at this micro level and not just the official communication or the diplomatic back and forth that is happening. Because this is part of the work of representation, which centers the epistemic agency of individuals and small communities, and it gives visibility to underrepresented voices within Ukraine, while also doing the work of decentering those dominant Western grand narratives and the overall stale view of Ukraine that much of the Western world has had. This is obviously work in progress, and in a way, this is work that will never stop happening, but I think that actually makes it more interesting from a research perspective to study and also to see it as one small piece of work that citizens are doing that is part of the larger work of resistance against oppression and aggression. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.